Hello, everyone. Hello, CISW members and anyone who's tuning in wherever you are, wherever you're at. Thank you for joining us for another webinar. As always, I am so happy to see your virtual names coming up on my screen. Before I get into the topic today and our wonderful presenters, I want to just introduce myself quickly. My name is Alexandra Zanis, and I am the Social Policy and Communications Coordinator at the Canadian Association of Social Workers. You may have already found our chat function. I do see some of you have found it. Feel free to log in there and let us know where you're tuning in from. We do also have a poll up, and so one of the good things about if you can see that poll is that's also where the slide presentation is going to be. So take a minute and answer that poll, letting us know where you are tuning in from. As always, the CISW is located on the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and I am so grateful and so lucky to be a guest here today as we acknowledge what is happening in BC with the flooding and the various other issues that are being caused by weather and storms. It's good to take a moment and also situate ourselves and the Indigenous land defenders who have been working very hard to ensure that our climate goals are met. So I want to take a minute and acknowledge that as well. Feel free to situate yourself in the chat, which treaties or unceded lands you are tuning in from as well. There's a couple little housekeeping notes before I pass it over to our presenters. One of them being that if you are looking for that certificate of attendance, that will be available to you after you have viewed the required viewing minutes, as well as after the presentation has concluded. So watch your email or feel free to log back on up to an hour after the presentation ends. You can download it directly from the platform. Everything you need for this presentation can also be found in that handout widget. Those blue and white icons at the bottom, they're called widgets. You can use any of those to access anything in the presentation you need. The handout widget will have the slides from today, a video that we will be playing in case you have any playback issues with that, as well as our CISW peer-to-peer support group, which is your space to talk about the challenges of everyday life in the social work profession in Canada. So feel free to check out that handout widget. Also, your screen is customizable, so take a minute and make it the best for your viewing needs. You can make the slides bigger, the video bigger, the chat and Q&A functions bigger. Just take a minute and make sure that the setup looks exactly like what you would prefer it to look like. We are joined by three incredible organizations today. Please take a minute, open that speaker bio widget at the bottom of your screen, read up a little bit about our presenters. We are joined by three incredible organizations, like I said, Sheena's Place, Body Brave, and NIED. All of them work very hard to correlate between eating disorders and helping professions such as social work. So we're very lucky to have them joining us today. I am going to pass it on. I'll show you the results from that poll, and then I will pass it on. So we've got, let's see. Okay, a lot from the prairies, Ontario, Quebec, Atlantic Canada. Hello to everyone from the West Coast, the North. Thank you all for tuning in. Without further ado, I am going to pass it over. Please take it away, and I am on the back end if you need anything. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Alexandra. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Exploring Diet Culture and Weight Stigma, Providing Care for All. This session is part 2 in a series on eating disorders that we're doing of 3, and we are thrilled that you have chosen to attend the session and learn more about providing care for clients who are struggling with eating disorders. We are very, very grateful that you have taken the time out of your day to learn a little bit about these issues and what you can do in your role. It is very likely that you are going to have clients who experience eating disorders throughout your career as mental health professionals, and so it's important to understand eating disorders as a social worker or psychotherapist so that clients you work with can get the proper care that they need for recovery. So we're so, so grateful. We are just going to take a brief moment to introduce ourselves as individuals, and then a little later on, we'll talk about ourselves as members of these different organizations. So my name is Erin Houston. I am the Training and Education Coordinator with Body Brave. I have lived experience of an eating disorder myself. I was diagnosed with anorexia nervosa when I was 16 and have experienced navigating the pediatric eating disorder hospital system and community-based supports systems as well as a result of that eating disorder. So I will have my co-facilitators, Ari and Caitlin, introduce themselves. Ari, if you'd like to go next.
Hi everyone, my name is Ari Maharaj. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Outreach and Education Coordinator at the National Eating Disorder Information Center. I also sit as a registered psychotherapist qualifying here in the province of Ontario. I have lived experience of other mental health challenges that I think very much inform a lot of the clinical work that I'm honored to do, both individual for folks who are experiencing financial challenges and group-based work that I get to do. And in my role at NEDIC, I feel like I get to do things like this, which I really love, provide educational opportunities to work with others to explore topics that I think we all need to explore. And diet culture and weight stigma are two of my favorites that we'll get to unpack a bit today, and I'm excited to reflect together with you. And I'll pass it over to Caitlin.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Caitlin Axelrod. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a social worker and the program and outreach coordinator at Sheena's Place in Toronto. I've been in my role at Sheena's Place for about 3 years now, and I've been involved in research and volunteering in the eating disorders field for about 8 years. I first became interested in the eating disorders field as a result of knowing many people with lived experience and as a result of being a member of a society that is strongly influenced by diet culture and many conflicting messages about food and bodies that we will talk about today. I'm very passionate about advocating for low barrier mental health support, as well as harm reduction and body inclusivity in my work at Sheena's Place and also in my personal and work and volunteering life outside of Sheena's Place. And I will pass it back over to Erin.
Great. Thank you guys both. We are going to dive into just kind of some of the housekeeping things and things we want to just start with right off the bat. And so we want to begin by taking a moment to connect with the land that we are on. And for those of us who are joining from somewhere that's close to Body Brave, acknowledging that this land is on the traditional and unceded territory of many nations, including the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas in the Hamilton area. It's really, really important for us as we learn and reflect about eating disorders and people's relationships with food. It's important that we recognize the systemic violence that some communities on the land that we call Canada have faced and continue to face today. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples often had their traditional methods of procuring food and their relationship with the land forcefully altered through the processes of settler colonization. The residential school system aimed to really sever these connections among children and therefore generationally with exploitative processes and treaties that weren't upheld, creating the conditions for poverty that many unfortunately still live in today. As of November 2021, 43 public long-term boil water advisories remain in 31 communities across Canada, and there are 30 short-term public drinking water advisories, all that are impacting these communities' ability to prepare and engage with food, and therefore their relationship with food as well. There are hundreds more active drinking water advisories that are not on public systems, so on private systems that aren't necessarily always tracked by the federal government, which also impact the day-to-day lives of thousands of Indigenous peoples across Canada. So for us as charities who provide treatment and support and resources to those with body image issues and eating disorders, Sheena's Place, NEDIC, and Body Brave acknowledge that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people are very often left out of body image and eating disorder spaces and conversations. This includes conversations about research, treatment, recovery spaces, and conversations surrounding stigma and support. So it is our responsibility to work towards decolonizing these spaces and making them spaces where Indigenous peoples feel welcoming and supported in the ways that they need to be, and create supportive environments for all folks who desire support. So as non-Indigenous settlers, we see acknowledging these truths and actively working towards reconciliation as critical, especially in the context of learning about mental health and food and the ways in which all of these things interact. If you want to learn more about the land that you are on, including language, treaties, all of those kinds of things, I'm putting a link in the chat here. And then on the resources as well, and in the slides, there are multiple resources if you want to just kind of start learning more a little bit about non-settler allyship or non-Indigenous settler allyship and the role that you can play in that. So we do just want to start off there as an important part of what we do and how we are approaching today. For today's session, we have three main objectives that we really want to focus on and have you come away with. We want to explore the topics of diet culture, weight stigma, and health using an anti-oppressive lens. We want to reflect on the implications of weight stigma, diet culture, and language on eating disorders and disordered eating. And then, of course, we want to share tools and strategies for adopting an eating disorder-informed lens in approaches to care. So those are kind of the overarching objectives for what we want you to walk away with today. And hopefully we meet our goals. A few housekeeping pieces just about today's session. During the session, we invite you to ask questions in the chat. We might answer kind of throughout the session, one of the three of us presenters, and questions in the Q&A we will respond to most likely at the end, or hopefully at the end if we can get to all of them. So depending on the kind of question you have or the nature of the question, kind of choose the appropriate avenue. References are included throughout the presentation, and then there's a full list of references at the end as well, and you have access to these slides in your handout. So if you need any of the references or additional information, those are all there for you. Please do what you need to do. We know it is still a pandemic and many folks have a lot of competing priorities and needs at this time. So if you need to eat or step out or any of those things, you are welcome to. This is being recorded and you will have access to that recording in the members portal and all of those things. So no concerns about that. We completely acknowledge that many people are coming in with a lot of different capacities right now. And finally, we as presenters are presenting from our own personal and professional contexts. These contexts and these ideas won't represent every perspective or approach, so we really do encourage you to take what feels relevant or empowering to you and leave the rest. The more critical thinking you can do about these ideas and things, the better. So thank you very much, and we really, really encourage that. The final part of this three-part series is next month on November 7th at 11 a.m. EST. And in this session, we are covering creating connection in eating disorder recovery, strategies for ongoing support. So we will be going over building therapeutic alliance with clients with eating disorders, different modalities of care, and information about resources and referring and those kinds of things for clients who are struggling with eating disorders. So I think it's going to be an exciting one. So you should all attend. Awesome. Now we just want to give brief introductions to our organizations to give you a little bit of background of the work we do and kind of the lens in which we are approaching these conversations. And I will have Ari start us off with a little bit about NEDIC.
Thanks, Erin. NEDIC, the National Eating Disorder Information Center, is a registered charity. We're based out of the University Health Network Center for Mental Health, located in Toronto General Hospital in Toronto, Ontario. We operate a national telephone toll-free helpline, as well as an online instant chat service that people can access at nedic.ca. It's an anonymous, confidential service that's self-referral, so some people who contact us have a formal eating disorder diagnosis, and many do not for whatever reason. You could just think that you're struggling with a relationship with body or weight. You might have a friend or a loved one who's struggling and you want to get support from, or you could be a clinician looking for resources to better support people in your care. We have thousands of folks reach out to get those immediate inquiries met, and we're able to provide in the moment support, help people's system navigate to provincially funded or private treatment options that might be eating disorder informed, and provide resources and education that include conversation guides to have with family physicians, resources with family and friends, etc. I'm also able to do community education initiatives. In the picture that you see on the very left of this slide, our outreach education team get to go into schools and camps across Canada. I'm really getting to talk to young people about eating disorder risk factors to really focus in on prevention, as we know that that's really important too. And I will pass it over to Caitlin.
Thanks, Ari. So Sheena's Place is a community mental health charity in Toronto, as I mentioned, and we support people affected by eating disorders and disordered eating. That includes people with their own lived experience and also caregivers and loved ones. We do so exclusively through the provision of group-based support, so no individual treatment or therapy, but we do offer many, many different types of groups. Currently, we are offering about 30 weekly groups online that fall into many different categories and types of modalities and support. All of our groups are free of charge, and they are open to anyone who is 17 and older in Ontario. No diagnosis or referral is required, so it is based on self-referral. And like NEDIC, we also offer outreach and education opportunities, so trainings and workshops for a variety of audiences. And if you're hoping to learn more about our programs, I'd encourage you to register for one of our information sessions. They happen every couple of weeks online, and the link to that is just on the homepage of our website. And I'll pass it to Erin.
Awesome. Thanks, Caitlin. And finally, Body Brave. Body Brave is a charitable nonprofit located in Hamilton, Ontario, and we provide low barrier treatment and support to clients across Ontario and Canada at large, depending on the type of support. So we offer group support, individual psychotherapy, medical assessments, and self-guided virtual support for clients, depending on the level of care that they are needing and the type of support that they are wanting. We also spend quite a bit of time kind of on the professional education side. So we have professional virtual trainings for physicians, which just launched last week, which is super exciting. Nurse practitioners, dietitians, social workers, and psychotherapists, all available on our e-learning platform. So those are kind of the two silos that we exist in, and we are very grateful to have them both, as they really do inform each other, and making sure that lived experience is really at the center of all that we do in terms of educating professionals. So awesome. That is a little bit about our work, where we are coming from, and the lens through which we kind of understand these things. So hopefully that helps provide a little bit of context as we start to dive into some of the content now. I do want to start just with a brief note on diet culture before we really dive into diet culture and the importance of kind of recognizing larger social impacts on eating disorders and our understanding of eating disorders. As we go through this section, kind of the full section of today, and talk about diet culture and weight stigma and ideas of health, we wanted to note that you may feel some resistance or hesitation to the topic. And we want you to know that that is completely normal. We also still experience that in different contexts and with different things kind of within these conversations. So diet culture is something that we are all surrounded by and have taken part in. But even more than that, many of us have invested a lot of time or energy or money into weight loss or dieting or lifestyle changes or trying to control our bodies in one sense or another, mainly kind of for that purpose of changing our bodies in that way. So because we've invested so much of ourselves into these parts of diet culture, we can be really, really hesitant to see some of the harsher realities that come with diet culture, and we might not be ready to like jump right into unlearning some of these things that diet culture teaches us that we might not even have realized that we've learned. So throughout this section, kind of the entire session today, we do ask that you keep an open mind, know that you are not alone in maybe some of those feelings of resistance or hesitancy to some of the ideas, because everything that we have learned has taught us the opposite. And you may not kind of walk away from this all in and ready to like dismantle every single component that we've talked about. And that is okay. Knowing a bit about diet culture and how it shows up in the world can be really, really powerful and a great entry point into thinking more critically about when we are working to support a client who is struggling with an eating disorder. So just a really important caveat that we want to start with, in case you do recognize any of that kind of hesitancy or resistance to any of these ideas. We just ask that you keep an open mind and take what feels relevant and feels powerful in the work that you do. Awesome. So we're going to start at the very beginning, just answering the question of what is diet culture, and diving into kind of that very general but very important question. So anti-diet dietitian Christy Harrison, who's a name you might have heard. She has an incredible podcast called Food Psych, and she does a lot of great work. She has a book, all of those things. She has a definition of diet culture that is one that a lot of us tend to like to use because it really does encapsulate a lot of the bigger ideas about diet culture in these nice ways. So she defines diet culture as a system of beliefs that equates thinness with health and higher status, promotes weight loss as a form of achieving better health and status, despite the facts that research has shown that intentional weight loss is not sustainable. A system of beliefs that values certain ways of eating over others, and a system of beliefs that oppresses folks who do not fit the diet culture image of health. And when we are talking about kind of this definition, there are a few caveats that we think it's really important to add from our work that we think about when we're talking about this system of beliefs that we all kind of live and work and play in. So when we talk about not fitting the diet culture image of health and people that face oppression as a result of diet culture, we need to be clear of the role that intersectionality and intersectional identities play in that experience of oppression. So Black folks, Indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, people who live with chronic illness, trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming, all of these kind of people or communities, as well as those who live in larger bodies, all face or experience diet culture in ways that are very, very different than I might as a mid-size white cisgender female. And that is because our expectations of what health or thinness look like are very much Eurocentric and based on, very white ideals, very gendered ideals, all of those pieces. So the experience of diet culture is not the same for everyone. And that's really, really important when we talk about that oppression piece, that it does not look the same for every single person. We also wanted to be specific in our collective definition, that we have added fitness along with thinness as a major player in the makeup of diet culture. So many of the ideas that we currently hold around fitness are rooted in fear of fatness rather than a desire for health. And so while a shift from the thin body ideal to the fit body ideal has kind of been lauded as a potential move towards health, the reality is that the fitness ideal is still founded on this idea of aesthetic perfection and kind of emphasizes the exclusion of some bodies over others. A really important note, thinking about kind of this really general definition as a system of beliefs and as something that, we all kind of see show up in different ways. Diet culture does not just affect those who are on diets or who are interested in weight loss. You do not need to participate in dieting to be participating in the culture of dieting and in what we know as diet culture. So moving away from the ideals held by diet culture is hard because we are surrounded by it. And so by understanding diet culture, it's the first step, and it's powerful when we're trying to understand eating disorders as complex mental illnesses. And we are working to support someone who is struggling with eating disorders. So by playing the role of normalizing disordered relationships with food and our bodies, in normalizing, striving for different, ideals in terms of what our bodies should look like, in terms of talking about foods in very specific, Black and white ways, diet culture becomes the backdrop that really lets eating disorders thrive and lets recovery kind of remain far away, a far away dream of some of our clients or some of us. So diet culture shows up in lots of ways, in ways that we are not always aware of or really thinking about critically. And we're going to go through just kind of the tip of the iceberg by looking at a collection of stock images, which are strange types of media. As you will see, they're kind of frightening, but illustrate elements of diet culture really, really well. And so we're going to go through a few of those and talk about ways that diet culture kind of show up for us. So one way the diet culture shows up in our day-to-day lives is the congratulating or celebrating of weight loss. And when we do this, or when this happens, it is perpetuating the idea that thinness is superior to fatness or any type of non-thinness, that thin bodies are inherently more desirable, that losing weight is a positive thing for all people, and that weight loss is somehow inherently healthy. The reality is that people can lose weight for a multitude of reasons, and not all of them are good. As a 17-year-old, the number of ladies at my church that came up to me and told me that I looked great when I was quite skeletal and my organs were in the process of shutting down is still really, really scary to me. So diet culture shows up in this assumed assumption that weight loss is always something to celebrate. Another way that diet culture shows up is when we use fitness or movement as a form of self-imposed punishment that we have to endure because of other behaviors like eating. So this includes fitness narratives like having to burn off calories or work off that piece of cake, or fitness boot camps, that kind of stuff. The belief that kind of beating up your body or pushing yourself beyond your physical means is a good and healthy thing to be doing. Movement in itself can be a great tool for creating connection to our bodies, but these narratives around fitness kind of create a further disconnect from ourselves and our bodies when we're using movement as a tool to punish ourselves. Another way that diet culture shows up is in healthcare patients' concerns or symptoms being ignored, and a blanket solution of losing weight kind of being offered by healthcare professionals. People in larger bodies often do not receive the care that they need or deserve because all problems are blamed on their weight, which is just not how health works. Patients in larger bodies report that they feel disrespected by providers, or that their weight is blamed for all of their problems, and so the actual core issues that they are facing are not really being addressed because of their weight. And this can lead to them opting out of seeking medical support, even if they are experiencing pretty serious medical issues. Diet culture shows up when we assign moral value to food. And this is a hard one, but food does not have moral value. So when we say that a food is good or bad, we are assigning our own moral judgments onto that food. That label is not inherent to that food in any way. So for someone who is experiencing food insecurity, who doesn't have access to food, in a sustainable way, a meal from a fast food restaurant that someone might consider bad is actually a great and healthy choice for them. But beyond that, beyond kind of, that dramatic example, food generally is not good or bad. Food is more than fuel. It is also community and tradition and comfort and belonging and connection. And so when we apply moral value to food, we are then assigning that moral value onto the person or persons who are eating that food, or even just considering eating that food. And so really looking at food as more than just fuel and as potentially good or bad fuel, but understanding food as, it should be in this very, very broad context in terms of people's relationships to it, and how food is a really, really powerful tool in people's lives for creating connection and support. Food advertising, oftentimes companies will advertise their food as guilt-free and similar to moral value, unless guilt is like an actual ingredient. On the ingredient list, all foods are guilt-free. They just are. I assure you, you do not have to feel guilty about eating food. It is just food. And so when we see language like that of guilt-free or clean or those kinds of things, that is those kind of moral judgments being placed on these foods, rather than them having those kind of inherent labels on them. This one hits close to me. I've had a lot of friends have to deal with this in their workplace and actually finding themselves partaking in disordered behavior as a result. But fitness or diet challenges in general are problematic in terms of kind of creating competition for people in terms of who can eat the most healthy or push themselves furthest physically, all of those things. A lot of times in a workplace, you might know what diet your coworkers are on, but you don't know their favorite color. And that is diet culture in action. The assumption that all people want to lose weight and that people are either actively or passively hoping to lose weight. And that is just not true. Not all people who have larger bodies or are in larger bodies want to be in smaller bodies. And this is the mentality that really stems from this idea that inside every larger body is a happier and thinner version of them waiting to be set free. Ridiculously untrue, but it is assuming the diet culture tenet that thinness and health are core to our identity and our ability to maintain a social status or relationships. This one is unfortunate because while all the other images I Googled for health or fitness, we see very thin people. For this image, I just looked up lazy, and the majority of the images were people in not as thin bodies. So diet culture tells us that inside everything or every person is a thinner version of them, and that if you are not thin, you are just not working hard enough, you're not trying hard enough, you're not doing enough, and therefore your body is suffering as a result. And so within diet culture, there is no space for people in non-thin bodies to be fit and strong and capable, which we know to be completely untrue. And finally, just associating weight as a primary indicator of health, which we will get into a little bit deeper. But the main way that this is kind of the main way that we see diet culture is equating thinness as healthy and non-thinness or fatness as unhealthy. And we know from working with people with eating disorders that there are people at all weights who are healthy and unhealthy. But most importantly, that just because someone isn't healthy doesn't mean that they don't have value or deserve treatment or empathy or support or any of those kinds of pieces. So there's a lot that's kind of being held on to when looking at this image. So looking at these stock images that are meant to communicate a sense of wellness or a picture of health, what do we notice about them? Are there any, feel free to put them in the chat, but are there any kind of thoughts about what we see here in these images? Is there anything that they have in common or that we can notice about these images? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, lots of things. And a few are kind of getting at what I think is really, really important here, but they are all young, but they are also all white. Yeah, absolutely. So this is also kind of an exercise in looking at the coded ways that we talk about health or wellness, in the coded ways that we read people's bodies, or that society shows us people's bodies, or what it is to be healthy and happy. When we talk about health and being healthy, what bodies are automatically being dismissed from the conversation just because we kind of live in a society and culture that is kind of built on very, very Eurocentric white supremacist ideas about health and about our relationship to health. So yeah, great points. Thank you guys for all of the responses. You are all 100% right in all of these pieces of what is really missing from these. So thank you. Diet culture and eating disorders, really just wanting to kind of bring these conversations together really quickly. So understanding diet culture is an important part of understanding eating disorders, not because eating disorders are diets, but because knowing that eating disorders are both developed and recovered from by people who exist in the wider cultural landscape of diet culture that upholds and perpetuates it impacts the way that we should be approaching them, impacts the way that we might approach eating disorders, knowing that they are developed and recovered from in this, larger social context. So we all live in the larger landscape of diet culture. Not all of us struggle with eating disorders, but people who are struggling with eating disorders do live within diet culture. So even if the cause of someone's eating disorder, we talked about in the last session, eating disorders can serve a lot of functions for people, and not all of them have to do with, diet culture, and that is 100% valid, and we see that lots of the time. So even if someone's eating disorder has nothing to do with these components that we're talking about in terms of diet culture, the space in which they are working to recover is within diet culture. And that means that they may be being praised for their eating disorder, they may be encouraged by others to engage in disordered eating, all of those pieces. So knowing this, it becomes really important for those of us who are responding to people with eating disorders to know that in addition to the eating disorder they are also fighting against all of these messages and ideas from a broader social context. Really briefly, diet culture has some pretty profound societal effects on us, and two ways that these show up is in weight stigma and fat phobia. So weight stigma is, these are just two kind of potential definitions that at Body Brave we like to use. You may know other definitions, and that is fantastic. Weight stigma is the discrimination or stereotyping based on someone's body size, and fat phobia is the belief that kind of all that stuff we talked about, that people are unhealthy, or that overweight people, overweight in quotations, are unhealthy, unhappy, lazy, or morally, inferior in some way, not trying hard enough, not taking care of themselves, all of those things. And so these experiences of weight stigma and fat phobia greatly impact someone who is seeking support for an eating disorder. They can lead to eating disorder behaviors or experiences being dismissed entirely by healthcare professionals. It can, create barriers to appropriate and timely treatment, which we know is so important. The faster that someone seeks treatment and help and support, the more likely they are to be able to recover. And this can lead to increases in depression and anxiety disorders, increasingly low body satisfaction and self-esteem, and an increase in maladaptive behaviors, including disordered eating behaviors, such as binge eating or restrictive patterns, and all of those things. So knowing kind of these effects that diet culture directly have on people that we can measure and do see is really, really important. And so to get a bit into the impacts of weight stigma and fat phobia, this flowchart just kind of quickly displays how weight stigmas connect to various health concerns. So weight stigma points to internalized weight stigma, and then that is connected to all of these other things, including body shame, appearance monitoring, decreased psychological well-being, increase of other mental health issues or concerns, and decreased physical health as well, which, can hold a multitude of things. Of course, these four components, the four kind of on the right there, had to check my hand of which side that was, can exist for anyone regardless of body size, but they become increasingly important when we're talking about weight stigmatization and its relationship to disordered eating behavior. So it's important to note that based on additional parts of people's identity, which we kind of all already touched on, and it's great that so many of you are talking about, these intersectional identities and the roles that they play, because it's really, really important when we're having these conversations. So based on someone's identity and how they show up physically, their physical identity, they may already be experiencing heightened body shame or appearance monitoring or any of those things. So this is true for people of color who often have to be very vigilant of their non-whiteness in especially public spaces, but almost any spaces. People with disabilities who are often consistently made aware of their bodies by existing in spaces that are designed for able-bodied people. Trans or non-binary or gender non-conforming folks who are constantly aware of how their gender is being perceived by the people around them. The list goes on. So those kind of four components do and can exist for anyone, but it's just, based on the person's identity, how they come into play and what that looks like. So just an important note when we're looking at this flow chart, which is a great tool, but there are, of course, caveats that are really, really important for us to understand if we're looking at this broader picture. Fantastic. I've heard enough of my voice. I bet you have too. So I will turn it over to Ari to take us through the next section of today, which is how we can kind of approach moving beyond some of these diet culture aspects of what we know and how we know it.
Thanks, Erin. I think I could always hear your voice, but I think as I've heard this first part, and I wonder if other people are in the same boat, I think it's a lot, right? Especially if this is maybe the first time in which you're hearing some of these messages. I know I've gotten a chance to do some education to healthcare providers in the past, and pre-service students and nursing schools and things like that. And in many cases, I'm really saddened by the comment of this is maybe the first time that I'm hearing that like it's okay to be in a bigger body. And I kind of just want to sit with that, and just in case any of you are sitting with that, because I'm already seeing some things in the chat where a lot of these biases and a lot of the weight stigma and fat phobia, in which Erin really nicely walked us through, is really entrenched in our systems. So it's okay if you're struggling right now, and I ask you to take a moment and a really big breath and just notice how you're feeling. Diet culture entrenches itself in many aspects of our lives. Our conversations at home, what we receive in our education and training, what we consume in media, what we hear from peers and colleagues. And over the next little bit, I am going to slow us down and get to talk about unlearning diet culture, just a you to you interaction before we pass over to Caitlin to talk about how you might be able to be a little bit more weight inclusive when you're communicating outwards. But for the next little bit, let's just talk you and you, and I guess me by virtue of being here. So let's get going. So we have some of diet culture's core myths here. Ones like smaller bodies are healthier, weight is a simple energy in, energy out equation, and that it's possible to control one's weight and shape. I'd love everyone to take a moment to think about where they've learned these messages and the implications that these messages might have on the way we think about weight and healthy eating and physical activity. So take a minute and do that, and feel free to put any of those reflections into the chat if you're comfortable doing that. But we're slowing down here. Yeah, someone sharing family, media, colleagues, doctors, on and on. Thanks for sharing. Social media is a big one. Yeah, I'm really curious on like where on social media too. Sometimes it's like our posts from our friends and things like that, or sometimes it's posts from colleagues. Sometimes it's in advertisements that we see. I recall getting these messages in elementary school, particularly in health class, for sure. Some of the ways in which our health and physical education curriculum still to this day can perpetuate some of the diet culture myths that are here. Sometimes in the movies that we see, in the way that, yeah, like the profit-driven culture in and around media in Hollywood can sometimes play to that. Growing up with family members who were really engaged in diet programs, whether it's Weight Watchers or other things. Yeah, even the algorithms now on social media too, if you start to talk about diets, and suddenly that's maybe the advertisements that you're seeing, especially on the Facebook-owned platforms from family members. And I'm like noting also the intersection folks are saying here with gender, and I think that's something to really sit with, like who has been sending these messages, and often the like misogynistic way in which that's played out, or the ways in which it's perpetuating gender ideals that serve some folk like purpose and not others. Magazines at the grocery store checkout, I know that always pissed me off. And still do. I'm really curious if folks could try, to the extent that they're comfortable, and like you're free to just do this for yourself if that's what you want to. Like it's most important that you try and you don't have to share it out loud. But let's take a moment and try to reframe these myths. So if I'm telling you that these are myths, what statement could be more possibly true? So instead of smaller bodies are healthier, what's an alternative statement that's a little bit closer to something that feels right for you? If folks don't mind trying to put some of those ideas in the chat, or even just doing that for themselves, that's okay too, especially for those watching on the recording. Instead of smaller bodies are healthier. All body types are healthy. Healthy bodies come in all sizes. I like that one. I'll bring up a great point. Sometimes smaller bodies indicate illness, so yeah, that's part of the reason why that's a myth. Ooh, I like health is not a moral imperative or achievement. Mental and physical health is partly measured by our self-acceptance. Health isn't relative to your body size. There are many other indicators of health. All shapes and bodies are natural and healthy. Health and the chase for healthism can be detrimental to the mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being of folks of varying identities. Cool. You all are going to be disappointed by my next slide showing our attempts, because I think some of these are better than those, but that's okay. Nourished bodies are healthier. Okay, let's move on to that second one. So how would we reframe weight is a simple energy in, energy out equation to something that's a little bit more true? What are we thinking? This one can be hard. Weight is a simple energy in, energy out equation. If we're reframing that. Weight is caused by gravity, that's all. Weight is based on a complex set of factors and can't be reduced to calories in and calories spent. Cool, I appreciate that. I sometimes like to think about diet culture when they're sending these myths as like a little voice on my shoulder that's like always trying to promise me like sweet solutions. Like if you just did this, if you follow this routine, if you buy this product in 6 weeks, you'll have the body that you want, the partner that you want, the job that you want, the something. It's like a short-term resource extraction initiative that I think we're seeing in many aspects of our society are sometimes not working or leading to pain. Weight is multifactorial, not entirely in our control, and not a reliable indicator of health. Weight is complex and dependent on many factors. It's physically impossible to control weight and shape from day to day, even hour to hour. Yeah, your weight fluctuates on a daily basis, for sure. And aging, the natural process of it. So you can think about when we're thinking about preventing eating disorders with children, for instance, how many of them are undergoing really natural weight gain over the course of puberty and are also getting really freaked out by it when they're also encountering diet culture at the same time. How that might contribute to a social cause of an eating disorder. Okay, let's try this last one. It's possible to control one's weight and shape. How would you reframe that into a message that's a little bit more true? It's possible to control one's weight and shape. It says possible is changing someone's height. That's a really interesting point, eh? We often talk about height, and I think we all know how much of that is genetics, and how come height and weight are often paired together as innate biological metrics, but we think we can control one much more than we can control the other. Someone's asking, what does that control even serve? And I think that's a really great point too. Intentional weight loss is actually associated with weight cycling, which we know is harmful to health and long term. There are many initiatives we can all take to support our health, but our weight and shape can sometimes be too complex to simply control. Cool. Thanks, everyone. For those who participated in the chat, and for the many who were, if you were participating in your head or on a piece of paper in front of you, or you're watching this recording and participating, I appreciate it. I think this can be sometimes really difficult, even if it sounds a little bit simplistic, and know that this is just the start of our journey together. And we'll have many resources at the end for those who kind of want to continue unpacking or exploring these myths. We're happy to do so. Here are some ideas that we have. So instead of it's possible to control one's weight, instead of smaller bodies are healthier, bodies come in a diversity of sizes and all can be healthy, really similar to some folks. Instead of weight is a simple energy and energy out equation, over 300 factors are responsible for weight, most outside of an individual's control. Like Aaron was really nicely talking about the social determinants of health and access really having an issue there. And finally, instead of it's possible to control one's weight or shape, trying to control weight or shame one's body is actually often harmful to someone's health. And so I want you again to notice how you feel as you read and listen to these messages and think about what comes up for you. Because sometimes there might be a part of us that's rejecting that, and other times there might be a part of us that's being set free by that. And I'm really curious on that you to you relationship and what's coming up for you as you do it. Yeah, I see some comments in the chat too around like some of the intersections here with like perfectionism, and especially talking about white supremacy. Like perfectionism, I feel like is often a tool of that, like that we should all be striving to be supreme, to be better. And who has that served, and what has it done to our planet, our society, our relationship, our interactions, our mental health? Where did that actually come from, and who's benefited from that? I really like to fundamentally believe that we all exist, and that's like deserving of love and respect as they are. And I feel like as mental health professionals, especially, that care of beneficence, of not wanting to do harm to our clients and really wanting to say that they're worthy of that unconditional validation and unconditional positive regard, I see you really have connections there. So let's keep moving. And I'm really curious as to, why do we comment on someone's weight? It might be like, I think we've all done it, and I will put my hand up and say, I totally have done it too. I think it's a normal part of the way in which diet culture messages talk to us about it. And so I'm really curious if anyone feels comfortable sharing why we comment. Why have they commented on someone's weight? Where has that come from? And I have some ideas on the next slide in case we feel shy as an audience, but why do we do that? I think people are trying to be encouraging. Yeah, that's a really valid point. Sometimes people think it's a compliment. They're providing compliments, or maybe sometimes it's their own personal fear of getting fat and associating that as a bad thing. Sometimes it's an attempt to make connection. Yeah, when I get to talk to teens especially, many of them are saying well, everyone's disparaging their body, so it's almost a way to bond. It's like a way to put yourself down, and everyone's putting themselves down, and you're all not feeling great, but then you feel connected to a group that's all feeling like that. And I always wonder who's benefiting from that relationship. To me, it's fundamentally really sad. Could be a reaction to recognize someone's efforts. A lot of times it's small talk. As visual people, we notice visual change, not often realize the connotations attached. For sure, your occipital lobe in the back of your brain take up most of your brain's energy, 30-40% of it. And so we are visual humans. I think we're all influenced by all of these myths, and maybe we're reproducing some of them by engaging in these comments. People think that they're being helpful. Cool. So here are some ideas that I have. Some ideas that I came up with, which I feel like some of you were sharing, and some of this might be a little bit different. if I'm trying to be really well-meaning and gentle and like thinking that this is coming from the best intentions possible, because I think we can all think about situations where it actually has been malicious and damaging and harmful. And so by sharing these things, I first want to note that these things are really harmful, and I think Erin really nicely talked on the harms of weight stigma on care. We'll talk about that in a sec too. But if I'm trying to be really well-intentioned, people could be worried about someone's physical health, like you should lose weight because like your blood pressure or like your cardiovascular health or whatever it might be, like something bad is going to happen to you. Some people maybe think about like we need to think about and point out the issue to encourage them to change their health practices, like to get more active maybe, or to seek out support from a healthcare professional. So I saw some folks in the chat indicating that too. And we're worried that maybe they're going to get teased for their appearance and feel shame. Or like we don't want our loved ones or people in our life to feel like we know that society is going to be stigmatizing, and maybe we're trying to be well-intentioned in protecting them. Those could be really well-intentioned reasons why we might have that comment. I really like the point that some folks are making in the chat too, that this slide's interesting because sometimes a lot of people only comment on weight when it's being lost and not gained. And I think that's true. Like we will talk about, and Erin's really nicely talked about the way in which fat phobia is systemically an issue in our society. But I think all of the comments and the weight focus in our society hurts people in all bodies. And that includes people who are in smaller bodies who are maybe being shamed for being smaller. Or maybe you're hearing people who are being told that they need that to change. Those can totally be intersecting impacts too. Just the way in which they're systemically reinforced by society might be different. And that's a time where we have to tease out individual relationships and family relationships with like societal expectations and relationships too. Okay. So let's keep these comments in the back of our mind as we watch this video. It's called Poodle Science. It's about 2-3 minutes long. We're going to put the link into the chat, and it's also in the handout section, I think Alexandra said, so feel free to check that out too if you end up with issues with it. But I'm going to click play and hopefully you'll hear it, and I'll post the link in the chat too.
There's a big problem at the center of our research on weight and health. What's the problem? Well, picture a society made up of dogs. Let's say poodles are the bossiest group. They're the ones you see down at the doggy park barking at all the other dogs about how to live their lives in order to be healthy. But the problem is, poodles think that every other kind of dog is just a really big, a really small, or a really fat poodle, when actually the other dogs aren't even poodles at all. They're terriers, or mastiffs, or greyhounds, or labs. And all of the thousands of different dog breeds have different lifespans and different health risks. Each one has evolved to use food differently for different specialties at surviving. Some for staying warm, some for running fast, and some for being strong. They're meant to be different sizes and weights. So the poodles think the mastiffs should lose weight, but a starving mastiff never becomes a poodle. The poodles don't understand that dogs come in many more sizes than they can imagine in their poodle-centric ways. So this becomes a problem when it comes to poodle science. When the poodles did their weight and health research and made their claim that lighter dogs are healthier and live longer, they weren't comparing thinner poodles and fatter poodles. They were comparing poodles and mastiffs. So the recommendation for mastiffs to lose weight is based on the false assumption that if all dogs reach poodle weight, then all dogs will have poodle health. But once again, a starved mastiff just isn't a poodle. This poodle science doesn't even test whether a starved mastiff lives longer than a mastiff who has enough to eat, because one would have to compare mastiffs who maintain poodle weight to mastiffs that maintain mastiff weight. And it turns out that starving mastiffs regain weight, which after all is a much better thing than starving. But the poodles can only see that regain as a failure of mastiff self-discipline. Look, poodles are great, but poodle-centric health policy is a nightmare. Good science tells us that it's better to recognize and respect the ways we're different, because how we're treated, having good friends, Having access to decent food, a place to play, restful sleep, and medical care make a huge difference in our health and longevity. For all of us, whatever our size.
Okay. Thanks, folks, for watching that video, and know that if you've had trouble, it should be there in the recording too, should you need it. Anyone have any thoughts on how they feel about that video before we unpack this slide? That ASDA website, the Association for Size, Diversity and Health, is a really wonderful resource for you to look to. They have lots of position papers, peer-reviewed articles, other videos and teaching tools, just for you to kind of digest and unpack that content to yourself. It's okay if you're skeptical of that too. I don't think any of us are trying to force you to think a certain way about something. I think I really want all of you to make sure that you're critically thinking, and we're just presenting another way of potentially thinking about it. Thanks, Caitlin, for putting that link in the chat too. The construct that they're deconstructing there a bit is BMI. That's the poodle science that was in the construct that the poodles were doing research on. And I think sometimes it can be a really non-threatening way to think about dogs as a species and humans as a species, and who the poodles are and who the other folks are. Sometimes as soon as you take the human out of it, you realize, whoa, like that doesn't sound very good. And BMI really was developed by a mathematician in 1830, 1850. Those classifications were kind of arbitrary, and I think as we've seen in the research going on, and you can see a lot of the sources at the bottom of that slide there, doesn't consider many other physical aspects of health. Started to be used really prevalent as a health measurement in the 1970s, and it doesn't really consider a lot of those social aspects of health. It's a really narrow construct, and it was meant as a population-based metric than anything. But here we have a lot of folks who are often using it to categorize that as individuals. That includes medical providers, many of us even, humans who were publicly looking at this information. And it's often used in research because it's cheap and easy to measure, but it really runs into an ecological fallacy in a research lens because it's a poor proxy for what it's actually being measured. Height and weight is really simple information to gather, but what does it actually mean? Instead, I think it's actually having a lot of detrimental effects. And there's a really wonderful book by Sabrina Strings that you'll see in the resources page that really gets to go into the intersections here with race and BMI too, that are really worrying. So I want to go back to what Erin was saying with weight stigma and make some direct connections for all of you. Weight stigma really predicts long-term health effects, chronic disease, and lower life expectancy in ways that aren't that great. And if you look at that clipboard, you can see folks who are impacted by weight stigma have increased blood pressure, blood sugar, and cortisol levels, increased mental health issues in terms of depression, anxiety, substance use, binge eating, and suicidality, decreased engagement with healthcare services, trust of healthcare providers, and adherence to care, and a decreased motivation to engage in physical activity. And if we go back in the middle there to some of the reasons why we might be commenting on someone's weight, even from a really well-intentioned place, which many comments on weight aren't, you can see that the impacts of weight stigma really speak to making those comments not being very helpful. They're harmful for physical health. They're not really getting people to change their health practices, including physical activity at all. And if anything, they're leading to people not wanting to get the help that they might need for whatever reason. It's only shaming people, including in their healthcare experiences, where with us, we'd want them to be able to build a relationship of trust. That might be showing up as an issue. And so a reminder as I transition over to Caitlin is to remember to locate someone in their system. This slide from Diane Newmark-Steiner, a researcher from the University of Minnesota that's done really wonderful work on weight stigma in this area, showed the differences in the way that a person can get impacted by weight-related issues. Sometimes they're individual relationships, self to self. Sometimes our family or our peers are influencing. Sometimes it's schools and institutions. Sometimes it's community, and sometimes it's society. And in my view, I want all of those factors to instead turn positive, to instead become weight inclusive. And these are the different levers in our society that we could potentially turn on. And right now, I think we're going to be focusing a lot on some of the individual things that you might be able to do to be weight inclusive. But even getting to unpack this with a client could look like getting to see where they've heard comments on physical activity or weight or health through these different systemic factors. Where have they heard it in society? Where have they heard it from community? And I've seen people in the chat talk about ways in which folks from certain cultural backgrounds might have had different expectations placed. Where have they heard that in their education? Where have they heard that from their friends or loved ones? Where have they heard that from themselves? Really unpacking the system and taking that comment seriously is something that we all can do. And so I, without further ado, will pass it over to Caitlin to talk about ways that we can reject diet culture and give you some more practical tips. So go ahead, Caitlin.
Thanks, Ari. So for the remainder of today, we will be talking about some strategies for rejecting diet culture. These can apply to both personal life and also social work practice. But like Erin said at the beginning, this is really only the tip of the iceberg. And so we will be providing a bit more information around strategies to support people, and inherent in that is rejecting diet culture in our third webinar. So today we'll give you a little taste of some of that stuff. So I am going to start with a few definitions. So listed on the slide here are a few frameworks that have been created over the years in opposition to diet culture and related systems of oppression, like many of you have mentioned in the chat. So things like racism, fat phobia, ableism, and more. So starting with the fat liberation movement, this is a movement that emerged in the 1960s in the USA in response to ever-present weight-based discrimination. So fat phobia and weight stigma are not new. These things have been going on for a very, very long time, much longer than since the 1960s. But the fat liberation movement essentially challenged the dominant model of quote-unquote obesity at the time. And this movement was led primarily by queer Black women and femmes. This movement aimed and still aims to deprioritize the significance that our society places on physical attractiveness and to combat fat shaming and weight-based discrimination. Now, moving on to body positivity, this is a movement that grew out of fat liberation. This movement is rooted in the belief that all human beings should have positive body image, meaning all humans should love their bodies and be proud of their bodies. The body positivity movement has gained traction over the years, especially through platforms like Instagram, where the hashtag has become increasingly popular and more people are becoming familiar with that term. And I imagine many of you are familiar with the term body positivity. Now, before moving on to our third framework, I want to acknowledge that, while body positivity can be a really helpful framework for many people, it can also be problematic. Like many things, body positivity has unfortunately been co-opted by diet culture in many cases. So we see corporations using this term to promote sales by, let's say, marginally changing their definitions of beauty, keeping in mind there are still kind of standards and definitions of beauty. So we might see a campaign from a company where their models are wearing like a size 10 instead of a size 4, and encouraging people that they just need to love their bodies. So this ties into the fact that body positivity centers an individual's self-perception. It's very individual. So while it might give people permission to love themselves, it also puts pressure on people to do so, despite the fact that people are still living in a world that is ripe with fat phobia, racism, ableism, transphobia, and more. What makes matters worse is that often we will see thin or straight-sized white cis women as the leaders or voices of this movement when it wasn't actually created by or for them primarily. One last thing I'll mention about body positivity is that the messaging often involves celebrating a body's functioning over its form or appearance. And while this framework, again, can be helpful for some people, especially people recovering from body image distress connected to an eating disorder, this messaging can also be quite harmful or unhelpful, especially for many disabled folks, where the body might not be functioning in the way that society deems as acceptable or appropriate, or maybe the body is not functioning as one might desire for themselves. So lastly, moving on to body neutrality. This is a movement that counters body positivity, or not counters, but is sort of an alternative framework. Body neutrality is about celebrating bodies beyond appearance. So it's about acknowledging that, given the ever-present societal messages about bodies, a person might not love their body all the time or every day, and that's completely okay. For folks living in bodies that especially are discriminated against, or for folks struggling with negative body image, aiming to love oneself might not be a realistic or a helpful goal. So there are other frameworks in this area. We don't have time to go through all of them, but I did just want to share a little bit about these three, as these are terms that you may have seen before or you may continue to see in the future. So we'll spend the rest of today talking about how to incorporate weight or body neutral approaches into your practice, stemming from body neutrality. Now, there are a few reasons why we are focusing on body or weight neutrality as opposed to something like fat liberation. And so those reasons are, the first being, when we meet a new client, we don't know what pre-existing beliefs they might have about bodies, food, and weight. And so starting with a more neutral approach might feel more comfortable, less judgmental, and more realistic than starting with something like fat liberation. Now, fat liberation might be the ultimate goal for some clients or all clients, but embracing fat liberation can be a lot easier when our clients have identified safe people for them in their lives who accept and appreciate them. And unpacking this dynamic, especially for clinicians who are thin or who have cis heteronormative identities, this might necessitate stronger alliance building before we can really dive in to an approach like fat liberation. And so incorporating weight neutral or body neutral practices is a way that we can actively support both people with eating disorders, people at risk of developing eating disorders, and really just anyone else in practice. So again, the term weight neutral approach has been adopted in opposition to diet culture's weight normative approach. So this would be the approach that bases health on weight and BMI, like Ari spoke to. So the content on this slide, we've already kind of covered through our conversation so far. So I won't spend too much time here, but essentially weight neutral approaches understand that a person's health or quality of life cannot be based on their size, that weight is determined by numerous factors, many of which people do not have control over changing, that bodies come in all shapes and sizes, and that people ultimately benefit from approaches that do not center weight. And we know that the research does show that this is the case. So all of that to say, this work is difficult. I'll give you just a moment to read the quote on the slide here. And, like Aaron spoke to in the beginning and like Ari spoke to as well, this is not easy work, and there is always change that can be made. And it's not easy going upstream against the cultural current, as the quote says. So I'll give you just a moment to read through that on your own. Okay, so moving on. One approach that we will talk about today is health at every size, also known as HAES. So this is just one example of a weight neutral approach. The HAES model draws upon research that exists on health and well-being to identify a few important points. So according to this framework, there are 5 core tenets, and these are things that any healthcare, mental health care provider, really anyone in life in general, can and should adhere to. So the first is weight inclusivity, so accepting and respecting the diversity of body shapes and sizes. Health enhancement, so that, social workers and other healthcare providers should be improving access to information and services and attending to not only physical health needs, but spiritual, social, economic, emotional, and other needs. Providing respectful care, so practitioners should be owning their biases and working to end weight stigma and discrimination. Eating for well-being. So practitioners can and should be promoting eating in a manner which balances individual nutritional needs, hunger, satiety, and pleasure. And not to say that social workers should be advising people on how to eat specifically, but really the point here being that eating is not just about core physical nutrition. It's also about pleasure and emotion and social life and culture. And lastly, life-enhancing movement. Practitioners should be promoting individually appropriate, enjoyable, life-enhancing physical activity rather than exercise that is focused on the goal of weight loss. So I know these are very broad points, so we'll break these down a little bit more through our recommendations for implementing weight-neutral approaches in your practice. But before we do that, I will mention that, like all frameworks, there are limitations to health at every size. As folks have mentioned in the chat already, frameworks that still center health can be problematic. Folks have all different types of definitions of what health means to them. My definition of health is not going to be the same as someone else's. And as we know, the history of fat phobia and weight stigma predates concerns about health. So those constructs and forms of oppression have existed long before concerns about health have. So we can't stop at health. We can't say we need to treat everyone with dignity and respect because people of all sizes can be healthy. No, we need to treat people with dignity and respect because everyone, regardless of their body shape and size, deserves that. And so HAES can be a great starting point, and it's important that we look beyond that in acknowledging that all humans are worthy of treatment and respect, and nobody owes anyone else their health status. All right, so moving on to some recommendations for building a weight-neutral practice. And surprise, surprise, the first section is about self-reflection. So reflecting on your own assumptions about weight, health, and human worth. So all of the things that we've been talking about today, what folks were thinking about and writing in the chat as Ari was speaking, considering the following questions as well can be good starting points. So do I make assumptions about others? It could be in your personal or professional context based on their size or weight. Assumptions could be around behaviors that people engage in, their personality, really anything about a person. What assumptions are being made? Am I more likely to be friends or friendly with folks of certain body types? So this speaks to the behaviors. And these things can be conscious or subconscious. And so really taking a look at who is in your life and how you treat those people. Are there patterns or trends that you're noticing based on what a person looks like or their body shape and size? And the third question here, what does a person's health say about their worth as a human being? So speaking to what I just mentioned a moment ago. So thinking again about how your biases, because we all have biases and assumptions, how do these shape your practice and your interactions with clients? As well, as we've mentioned, this is just the beginning. It might be the beginning of learning for some of you. This might be a part of a longer process, but doing your best to learn more about weight neutral approaches, including body liberation, fat liberation, body positivity, body neutrality, all of these things, and spending intentional time considering how you can incorporate these into your work. I'll mention too that at the bottom of this slide is a link to the Harvard implicit weight bias test. So Harvard has a series of implicit bias tests for different things, including race and weight. And this could be an interesting place to start around identifying some of those subconscious biases that might be present. Next, talking about physical settings. So I know many people are probably still working online, and some of this will apply to that as well. But especially in spaces where you are working with people in person, thinking about how accommodating or accessible or welcoming that space is. Advocating for seating or furniture and room setups that accommodate all bodies is really important. So how big are your chairs? How much weight can those chairs withhold? Are there armrests on the chairs? Is your space wheelchair accessible? Is there space for mobility devices? So thinking about all of that. As well, being aware of mirrors and reflective surfaces, not to say that these things are bad, but just noticing, where those things are in your office or your space, and knowing that this could bring up some difficult emotions or reactions for some people. Ensuring that health messaging, so any kind of, anything, programs, campaigns, resources, does not focus on weight. I think we've made that pretty clear at this point. And ensuring that images of people in all materials include a diverse array of bodies. So not that we can't just, include images of people and stop there, but this is a really important part of supporting people and hopefully feeling welcome or accepted in various spaces. Next, working one-on-one with clients. So this is where we will really dive more into this in our next webinar. But a few key points here are to first avoid asking clients how much they weigh or commenting on weight fluctuations. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to this. So for example, if a therapist is working with someone with their eating disorder, there are certain modalities that do require weight checks and weigh-ins that the therapist would actually do with that person. Aside from something specific like that, we really don't need to be asking people about their weight or making comments. Thinking back to the conversation about why we comment on someone's weight or ask questions, really thinking about the intention. If we're worried about some aspect of their health or some other part of them, how else can we have that conversation that is not connected to weight? Using language as well that does not apply morality to food, eating, or movement. So we saw this in the beginning when Erin was talking about, words like good or bad food, unhealthy or healthy food, words like guilty pleasure. So noticing if those are coming up in our practice. A lot of these things are so automatic and ingrained in how we speak about food. And so just doing your best to notice when that happens in both personal and professional contexts can go a long way. Exploring food and movement qualitatively with your client, not just quantitatively. So we spoke a little bit about this in the previous webinar around what questions to ask and the importance of exploring food and movement from a cultural, social, emotional, and spiritual perspective, not just around physicality or quantity. And then lastly on this slide, being cautious around using examples that relate to food or diet or eating, even things like terms around like binge watching Netflix or something like that. Like those terms are not the most appropriate or the most helpful for a lot of people. So just noticing when we gravitate towards speaking about food and bodies and being cognizant of how we do that. Okay, next, a few more points here. Again, we mentioned this in the first webinar, but including questions about disordered eating behaviors or concerns on intake forms and questionnaires, not asking about weight on those things, working towards goals that are tangible, but not focused on weight. Again, unfortunately, in the social work field and in therapy spaces, I have seen weight loss programs and all sorts of things that should not be in those spaces or, in my opinion, in any spaces. So really trying to help clients set goals unrelated to weight. That being said, clients might come to you and express that this is a goal or a concern of theirs. They might be concerned about their weight or express that they want to lose weight or change their body in some way. And while that's not something that we think is appropriate for social workers to support people in doing, it's really important that we're able to have those conversations with clients, right? We don't want to be dismissive of clients' goals or concerns. Given the context that we live in, it is totally logical that someone would want to lose weight or go on a diet. And so we really don't want to be reinforcing any shame or making the client feel like we're judging them as a result of that. And so using this as an opportunity for discussion, like what would it mean to you to lose weight or to change your body in this way? What messages have influenced this? And honestly, talking about some of the questions that we have talked about today. As well, ensuring that resources that you share or recommend are body neutral and that they do not perpetuate diet culture. And preparing to support your client through specific situations that might be challenging. Many people with and without eating disorders might feel disconnected from their bodies. And so supporting our clients in reconnecting in a safe way is important. And again, we'll touch more on this in the next webinar. And lastly, as I kind of already mentioned, we don't want to be avoiding conversations about weight. So while we don't want to promote weight loss, we do want our clients to feel comfortable speaking with us. So if a client perceives us as judgmental, like for example, really opposed to dieting, they might be less comfortable sharing. And this may reinforce, as I said, feelings of shame. And like we mentioned today, internalized weight stigma is very real. And so we don't want to reinforce internalized weight stigma, yet we also don't want to reinforce shame about having those feelings. And so this is something that we will touch more on next time. So as we move into our last few minutes of today, I'll invite everyone to think about how can you incorporate weight neutral approaches into your social work practice? So maybe taking like 2 minutes, if anyone does want to share in the chat, if there's anything that we've shared today that's resonating with you, if there's anything we haven't shared that you're already doing or that you'd like to try doing, we would love to hear from you. So we'll take the next couple minutes to do that. And then I will cover some of the resources really quickly that we have listed in the slides. And I think we're able to stay on for a few extra minutes if there are additional questions.
Just jumping in the site, like we saw that there were 2 questions on the Q&A already and typed in answers to them, but if those folks feel like their questions are still relevant, just please type back that question. We're happy to re-answer if you need to.
Yes, thank you. Okay, well, I will go through the last few slides and then we'll touch back in with the chat. So essentially, these are the same slides that we've included in our previous presentation as well. This first page is very Toronto-centric, so I apologize for many of you who are not in Toronto. These are some eating disorder options, treatment options, but I will point your attention to NEDIC's website and helpline at the top. On the next one here, we have eating disorder support options. That includes organizations across Canada and internationally. I'm sorry, the spacing is weird here. If you download them, it will look fine. And support for caregivers as well. And then some other resource recommendations around eating disorders, around training for health and mental health care providers. And then lastly, more resources about what we've talked about today. So health at every size, weight stigma. The Poodle Science video is linked in here, as well as the book that Ari referenced, Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia by Sabrina Strings. All right, so that brings us to the end. Again, we'll stay on for a couple of minutes, so if anyone does have a follow-up question or a new question, please let us know.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. What a phenomenal presentation. I have been sitting here in complete awe, so thank you to our webinar presenters. There are a couple questions in the Q&A. I don't know if we have some time to address them online. Yeah? Okay. Excellent. For any folks who are
yeah, so it looks like we have
still.
Oh, sorry.
No, my internet.
Sorry, Alexandra. I was
today.
just going to say that
Caitlin.
we did answer them in the chat, in the Q&A. But if those folks are unclear about our answers, they're welcome to bring those questions back up.
Wonderful. Alrighty. The poodle science video is included in the handout widget. I'm just seeing a chat right now, so feel free to click that handout widget at the bottom of your screen, and that will bring you to the handout section. I'm just going to take a quick peek at the Q&A. There are there's one new question, folks. I don't know, maybe we can answer it. What are your thoughts on peer groups like Overeaters Anonymous for someone not trying to lose weight but gain body acceptance?
That's a really good question. I can start, and Ari and Erin, if you'd like to add anything. I think everyone's needs are going to be different when joining different groups, so I don't want to speak on behalf of everyone. But one thing I will say around groups like Overeaters Anonymous is that they will typically use an addictions model to look at binge eating or overeating. And for some people, this is a helpful framework, but for others, it is not. And it can reinforce restriction, which can then perpetuate something like binge eating. So I think we spoke about the restrict binge cycle in part 1. So if these terms are new to you, you can check that out. But unlike substances, we can't abstain from food. And so programs that reinforce or emphasize abstinence with food can be, again, really unhelpful for some people. So that's all I have to say about it. I'll let Ari or Erin jump in.
Yeah, I can jump in quick and say, like some of the organizations listed here, like Sheena's Place and Body Brave, I think really do see value in body acceptance, and folks having an ability to have conversations with people about it in a safe way is something that's really important. And support services offered by those two organizations, if you're in Ontario or in some cases across the country, know that there are supports available. And if you ever call or chat into the NEDIC helpline, there are some wonderful community-based organizations who are doing work in peer support, where folks who have lived experience of an eating disorder have now become mentors and have some supervision and some training behind that, and are able to help people guide through their experience in a way that can sometimes feel a little bit lower barrier and a little bit lower risk. Because I do feel like getting to talk to folks about your experience is sometimes a really wonderful first step into recovery, whatever that means to you. So feel free to check out those initial supports as a potential add-on to a kind of support. If a client is bringing up Overeaters Anonymous, I think you could use those as potential reframes or as something for them to try and see how it feels. And the helpline, if you ever want to chat in or call in, will have up-to-date listings of other folks across the country, depending on where you're located. Some jurisdictions like Alberta or BC or Nova Scotia will have some more specific options for you there too.
Yeah, amazing. I will flag for everyone that the chat line is such a wonderful way to respond to the ongoing challenges of our switch to a virtual world. And I would encourage everyone to take a minute and check out that chat line, because it's a wonderful support tool for those of you who are working with folks who are experiencing disordered eating or any kind of eating disorder. I would definitely flag that for you. We are kind of getting towards the end of our time, so I want to be cognizant of those folks who have to leave. But maybe one more question. Just because there's so many wonderful things coming in here. Maybe as a final kind of wrap up, if you folks can touch on, I wonder some responses you can make when other people come up to someone and talk about diets. What works for you in terms of the response to, I guess, maybe even just shut down that kind of questioning? If you can just maybe leave us with your thoughts there.
This is a really good question. I will share that Sheena's Place has a resource that we have compiled with possible responses to diet talk or body comments. I don't have it available in this moment, but perhaps we can make this available in the handouts for part 3, and then folks can access that handout from there. But I honestly, something that quickly comes to mind is changing the subject. If you're not comfortable confronting the comment or providing education, just changing the subject is a great approach, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would echo that. There's lots of different things, and some of it really depends on your relationship with the person and, how comfortable you are. Maybe saying, like, actually, like, I've set a boundary that I don't really want to be talking about, like, diets or, like, food or that kind of stuff. Or if that doesn't feel safe, just changing the subject, bringing up something else that maybe is kind of adjacent to it, so it doesn't feel like an abrupt conversation change that someone's going to comment on or think about really specifically, but just wanting to shift that conversation in whatever way feels safest. And if it is someone who you have a closer relationship to, saying outright, like, actually, like, those aren't conversations that I want to be having right now, or I'm not in a place to be thinking about other people's bodies or any of those things, just to kind of help limit those conversations in the future as well as best you can. But definitely depends on your relationship with the person and kind of the level of trust or support you find within them, I would say.
One reminder that I like to keep for myself is something I have as like a little validation almost, is like someone's reaction to me is a reflection of them. And so like knowing that like maybe that's where they're at, and if I don't feel like I'm safe to like combat that, like thinking about if I am a bit heightened afterwards, or like knowing that it's okay to self-soothe, knowing that it's okay to like that didn't necessarily impact my relationship with me, and getting to take care of the parts of me that became activated at that. Sometimes it is going to feel safe and you're going to want to advocate on behalf of other people in those social interactions, and other times you might have to take care of yourself first before you get to a place to do that. And whether it's reminding people of some of the scientific evidence you've learned today, whether it's affirming qualities and abilities that are unrelated to food or physical appearance, or whether it's providing education, like sharing that Sheena's Place resource that Caitlin will put at the end in part 3. Those are some other things too.
Yes, wonderful. Oh, I love that, and I'm a big fan of boundaries. So this is something that I experience as well with my family, and it's something that I think it's very important, whether they're talking to you about yourself or whether they're talking about people around you, being able to create boundaries that say, this is not something that I want to talk about. Maybe providing some resources, that self-soothing, that self-care. I think those are just such wonderful little tidbits to leave us with. So if you haven't registered for part 3 yet, please do. And if you did not watch part 1, you can still watch that recorded version. Use the registration page that you used to register for this webinar, or go to the CASW webinar page to have more information about that. Another huge thank you to our wonderful, wonderful webinar presenters. There's so much that goes on behind the scenes to make these events possible. So just a huge thank you for the time and commitment to hosting this 3-part series with CASW and providing such a wonderful resource for social workers and the social work profession as a whole. I am very, very grateful to you 3 and your organizations. Just to conclude, your webinar certificate of attendance will be sent to you up to an hour after this presentation concludes. So watch your email, or feel free to log back on and watch it directly or download it directly from the platform. You can also watch the on-demand version once we conclude here today, or send it to your peers, your friends, your family. You can share this webinar as you see fit. With all that being said, I think I will end this webcast today. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for spending this hour and a half with us. It is so wonderful to see everyone's names, and we will see you all for part 3. Thanks, everyone.